Phonology is the categorization of sounds used in languages. A language's phonology consists of two main parts, the phonemic inventory and the phonotactics. A phonemic inventory is the set of phonemes that can be used to form words, and phonotactics are the rules that determine how those phonemes can be put together. Let's talk about the inventory first. A phoneme is an abstract unit of sound used in spoken language. The smallest meaningful difference there can be between two words in the same language is replacing one phoneme with another. Phonemes themselves are not sounds, but they are distinguished by their phonetic realizations, the sounds that appear at a surface level when the phonemes are used in words. A single phoneme can have multiple realizations, which are called its allophones. Which allophone is used often depends on the surrounding context of what other phonemes appear around it in a word. But it's also common for realizations to vary from speaker to speaker. The set of phonemes that exist in a given language is that language's phonemic inventory. It's entirely possible for different phoneticians to come to different conclusions about what phonemes a language has, because, like most things in nature, language is messy and often difficult to categorize. To present a phonemic inventory, it's handy to organize phonemes into charts, sorted according to their most basic phonetic realizations, like this chart which I made categorizing LdP consonants. This chart contains slightly inaccurate information, which, to those familiar with the notation, is transparently intended to make the chart itself more compact. However, given that I'm about to spend a few minutes explaining how these charts are meant to be read, here's a more accurate version. See, it just doesn't look as good this way, there's a lot more empty space. Anyway, this chart lists LdP's consonant phonemes. Each phoneme is represented using both the way it is spelled in LdP and with its representation in the International Phonetic Alphabet. The IPA, regulated by the International Phonetic Association, is an international standard for phonemic and phonetic transcription. Since the same alphabet is used both for phonemic analysis and for phonetic transcription, the two are distinguished by placing phonemic analysis between slashes and phonetic transcription between square brackets. The columns of this chart represent place of articulation, and the rows represent manner of articulation. A place of articulation is where in the mouth a sound is produced. Labial means lips, alveolar means the alveolar ridge, which is right behind the top front teeth, postalveolar means a little bit behind the alveolar ridge, and velar means the velum, or soft palate, the back of the roof of the mouth. In general, consonant phonemes involve two articulators, an active articulator and a passive articulator, which interact in an articulatory gesture to produce a sound. The primary active articulators used in spoken languages are the lips in labial consonants, the tongue in lingual consonants, and the larynx in laryngeal consonants. Passive articulators are more numerous, and as such, they're usually what place of articulation categories on these charts are named after. You'll notice that an exception on this chart is the labial column, which technically can be divided further into bilabial with both lips against each other, and labiodental with the bottom lip against the top teeth. You'll also notice that the W here is listed in two columns, which we will get to. A manner of articulation is the way a sound is produced. All the consonants in LdP are pulmonic consonants, meaning that they are pronounced by restricting the airflow from the lungs in specific ways. Nasals, or nasal stops, have the two articulators connect while allowing sound to pass through the nasal cavity. Plosives, or stops, block the airflow entirely, building up pressure at the place of articulation which produces a sound when released. Fricatives are pronounced by two articulators coming very close together, bottlenecking the air into a specific turbulent path. Affricates are consonants that start like plosives but are released as fricatives. They're the stops that don't. Approximants have their articulators come close together, but not close enough to make the airflow turbulent. Both approximants in LdP are special cases. W is a labiovelar approximant. It's pronounced with rounded lips, so it's labial, and it's also pronounced with the body of the tongue approaching the soft palate, so it's velar. Since it's pronounced in two places of articulation at once, it is said to be co-articulated. L is an alveolar lateral approximant. Lateral means that the sound actually comes from the sides of the mouth. And then there's rhotic, which is a completely meaningless category. Okay, that's not entirely fair. Rhotic means R-like sound, the sorts of sounds that are represented in the Latin alphabet with the letter R. LdP's rhotic consonant is what I like to call the whatever rhotic, and we're gonna have to put a pin in that and come back to it later. So, one more thing about how to read this consonant chart before I get into actually talking about this consonant inventory. You'll notice that some of the manner of articulation categories cover two rows. In all of those cases, the top row contains voiceless consonants, and the bottom row contains voiced consonants. Voicedness, or just voice, is a distinction made for whether or not the vocal cords vibrate while pronouncing a sound. This act of vibrating your vocal cords is called voicing. Okay, I think that's all the basics covered. If you don't mind, I'm gonna switch back to the more compact version of the chart now. There we are, much nicer. Aspiration is essentially when you exhale a little bit after a consonant is released. Most major languages have at least two sets of plosives. Languages like French distinguish between stops with voicedness, with all stops stops being unaspirated. Languages like Mandarin distinguish between stops with aspiration, with all stops being unvoiced. Languages like Hindi distinguish between voicedness and aspiration separately. And then there's languages like English, which distinguish between their two stop series with a combination of voicedness and aspiration. Voiceless stops in English, like in LdP, are both voiceless and aspirated. This is easiest to notice by pointing out a context in English where they are not aspirated. The K in ki is aspirated, but the K in ski is unaspirated. Now let's get back to the whatever rhotic. The letter R is strange. It's pronounced in a very wide variety of ways with very little actually connecting them. Nonetheless, most major languages have some sort of R sound. As a result, it's common for IALs to recommend that people learning the language just pronounce the letter R however they're used to pronouncing it in their native language. Lingua de Planeta's vowels are I, U, E, O, A. This is the 5-vowel system. You might know it from languages like Spanish and Japanese. This is the most commonly used set of vowels across different languages, and for an international auxiliary language, there isn't really any reason to use anything else. Vowels are arranged on charts like this according to their positions in vowel space. The horizontal axis is where in the mouth the tongue is positioned, and the vertical axis is how open the mouth is. Additionally, the open vowel A is usually a central vowel, halfway between front and back. Since in 5-vowel languages like this one it's the only central vowel, this is shown by having it span across two columns rather than giving it its own central column. But yeah, there really is not anything interesting I can say about the 5-vowel system. If language was food, then the 5-vowel system would be water. In addition to the inventory, a language's phonology also includes its phonotactics, the rules for how phonemes can be put together to form words. A lot of auxiliary languages don't define their phonotactics at all, which is how you end up with words like in Sambasa. Unfortunately, LdP also seems to have this same problem. LdP words tend to be borrowed almost directly from source languages, with little to no consideration being made for pronounceability. Let me explain. Spoken languages tend to group phonemes into syllables. A syllable has some phoneme, typically a vowel, at its core, called its nucleus, which can be preceded with a set of consonants called the onset, and followed by a set of consonants called its coda. A language's phonotactics restrict what phonemes and sequences of phonemes are allowed in each position. In English, the velar nasal phoneme, ng, only appears in the coda of syllables, in words like wing, song, and conlang. Even though ng is a perfectly normal English phoneme, a syllable that starts with a velar nasal, like ngarf, doesn't subjectively feel like an English word to native speakers, and as such, untrained English speakers will have to spend time becoming comfortable with putting phonemes in an unfamiliar order before they are able to speak a language which allows a velar nasal in the onset of a syllable. Orthography is the way a language is written. For an international auxiliary language like LdP, this should be as boring as possible. There is room for creativity in designing how a language writes things, but for an IAL, clarity should be prioritized above all else. The Latin alphabet is the most commonly used writing system, and it's used in a very wide variety of ways. It's common for different languages to pronounce the same sequence of letters completely differently. When designing auxlangs, it's generally understood that the best practice is to use the Latin alphabet more or less phonetically, with everything pronounced the same way regardless of context. So, it's always possible to unambiguously determine pronunciation from spelling alone. However, even if spelling to pronunciation is simple and clear, that does not automatically make it possible to unambiguously determine spelling from pronunciation. In many languages, but not all, words with more than one syllable have at least one of their syllables emphasized more than the others. This is the stress syllable of that word. A stress syllable can be a higher pitch, louder, longer, or some combination of these. While in some languages stress always follows a specific predictable pattern, in others, stress is a phonemic feature, a meaningful distinction which can be used to differentiate between specific words. In English, stress is the difference between the words insight and insight. Grammar is the underlying structure of a language. Where phonology and orthography are what determine a language's surface level aesthetic, grammar is the backbone, the heart of what makes the language tick. When making a conlang, grammar is where the conlanger has the most room for artistic expression. It's what can make a language truly unique, and it's also the most difficult aspect to fully appreciate. For an international auxiliary language, grammar can be the most difficult thing to get right, because there are multiple conflicting philosophies regarding how an auxlang should work. It's commonly agreed that an auxlang's grammar should be simple, elegant, and consistent. Once you've learned a few easy-to-understand rules, a few months of dedicated memorization of pure vocabulary will be all that separate you from full fluency. It's also commonly agreed that it should be possible to say anything in an auxlang that you can say in your native language, allowing, but not requiring, you to make any of the subtle distinctions that you're accustomed to. Any text may be translated into and out of the auxlang without the loss of any information along the way. These two goals both sound great, and it's impossible to achieve them at the same time. The more things a grammar allows you to do, the more complex that grammar must be, and vice versa. For that matter, it's also impossible to fully achieve either goal separately. Natural languages, as it turns out, are complicated, and if a conlang were to actually capture the sum total of all grammatical distinctions made across all natural languages, that conlang would be far too complex to ever be practically used as an auxiliary language. On the other hand, natural languages, as it turns out, are diverse, and what's intuitive and simple to some will always seem arbitrary and complex to others. This paradox is part of why I don't think it's possible for an international auxiliary language to actually be good. Nonetheless, the design challenge of trying to balance these conflicting goals can be an enticing one, and it's worthwhile to examine and appreciate the craftsmanship that goes into trying to solve this paradox, even if the result inevitably ends up as something that wouldn't really work as a truly neutral international language. LdP's angle is to favor elegance over expressiveness. An easy thing to point out is the complete lack of a word for the. It's just not a thing that you can say. While in English you can make a meaningful distinction between the cats sleep and cats sleep, in LdP both sentences are translated as kotas somni. The word the is a definite article, and while definite articles are relatively common, they aren't universal, and to someone who doesn't speak a language that has them, the distinction can feel arbitrary and confusing. I mean, how would you explain to someone who speaks a language without definite articles what the word the means? Bonus points if you can also explain the difference between the and that. Some other common but not universal grammatical distinctions exist in LdP entirely optionally. For example, the word kota, in its most basic form, does not contain any information about number. It could mean either cat or cats, but you can specify plural using an optional plural suffix, with kotas, and you can specify singular using an optional singular suffix, with kotage, or by just saying un kota, which specifically means one cat. Additionally, the word kota does not contain any information about gender. While in English, the basic form of a noun being ungendered is completely normal, some languages have grammatical gender, which, side note, isn't the same thing as gender. Grammatical gender is a system of classifying nouns into mostly arbitrary categories that function differently. In Indo-European languages that have grammatical gender, words for women and men are usually put into different noun categories, so those specific grammatical genders are usually called feminine and masculine, respectively. But 1, that's not the only way grammatical gender can work. The noun classes can be based on literally anything or nothing at all. And 2, the feminine and masculine genders in Indo-European languages have almost nothing to do with the genders they're named after. In German, the actual literal word for girl is grammatically neuter. It's almost completely arbitrary which words belong in which class in different languages, with the only exception being that words for things that can have genders generally, but not always, use the corresponding grammatical gender. Anyway, speakers of languages that have grammatical gender are used to always specifying the genders of animals in all contexts, the same way speakers of languages with grammatical number are used to always specifying whether or not there's more than one of something, the system used for making new words out of existing words. It's common for auxiliary languages to attempt to make deriving words a completely regular process. Consider in English the various ways to derive nouns from adjectives, even though a noun that comes from an adjective usually has a completely predictable meaning. A common solution used in IALs is to have all words of a certain part of speech end with a specific letter. Then you can just swap out that one letter to derive new words. This was popularized by Esperanto, where nouns end with o and adjectives end with a. This sort of system works pretty good, with the only problem being the restriction it puts on vocabulary, endonyms. When talking about a specific place, an endonym is the name for that place used by the people who live there, whereas an exonym is a name applied to that place by people outside of it. For an IAL to be truly neutral, I think it's important for everyone to be able to refer to the place where they live by the name they call it when talking to other people who live there. This same principle can apply to names of people, cultures, and languages. However, using endonyms is often in direct contradiction with the stated design goals of international auxiliary language. It's very common for a name imposed on a region by outsiders to be more internationally recognizable than the native name for the region. In these cases, more often than not, you'll see auxlangs default to using the more well-known exonyms rather than the more culturally neutral endonym. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, where I'll be reviewing Viosa. And by the way, if this was your first episode of Conlang Critic, thanks for sticking around this long. It's people like you who have made me able to believe that I can become a full-fledged professional YouTuber in the near future. If you're at all interested in learning more about conlangs, I highly recommend the series The Art of Language Invention created by David J. Peterson, the guy who made the languages in Game of Thrones. If you like this video, be sure to share it, support the Patreon bell notification.
Subscribe, like, comment, subscribe, like, comment, subscribe.
Flaggill.
Ottawa waso o paliale sinaking tawani Niking kute kalamasina tani sa